Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Aubrey Reeves, President and CEO of Business and Arts. Before we begin, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm a settler speaking to you from Toronto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat people, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacies, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. We acknowledge and are grateful to all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. A big thank you to the Speaker Series presenting partner, Power Corporation of Canada, whose support enables us to bring these kinds of discussions to you. We're grateful to Power Corporation's continued support. Thank you also to our supporting partners, RBC and ACG. I'd like to take a moment to highlight that nominations are now open for the 2026 Business and Arts Awards. We have 5 awards, which recognize exceptional volunteers, leaders, and organizations who have made a significant contribution to the arts in Canada. You can be a part of the celebration by nominating a champion of the arts, or even yourself. You can learn more by visiting businessandarts.org/nominate. Okay, I'm going to move on to a few housekeeping items. We're happy to have ASL interpretation for today's session. Auto-generated English and French captions can also be turned on. Only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on today, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box. The session is scheduled for 1 hour. Today's session will explore the ethical considerations of artificial intelligence and how arts organizations can ensure it aligns with their missions and values. I just want to emphasize that this is not intended to be a how-to session on AI. Rather, this is a conversation diving into the evolving policy landscape in Canada and how arts organizations can shape frameworks that support creative, equitable, and responsible outcomes. Earlier this month, in our signature Arts Fest program, we did offer a practical and hands-on training session called AI Tools for Small Arts Organizations. This session was led by Inga Petri, who is also in the audience today, and I hope will join in the conversation in the chat. For those of you who are participants in the Arts Fest program, the recording of that training session will be available soon. Now, let me introduce our 2 panelists. First up, Owais Lightwala is an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University in the Creative School, focusing on entrepreneurship, leadership, and innovation in creative industries. Beginning his career as managing director of Why Not Theatre, Owais is now the founding director of the Creative School Chrysalis, a multidisciplinary performance hub. He also works with Canadian Heritage, developing AI-powered solutions for the cultural sector. And he has designed leadership programs for the National Arts Centre and Toronto Arts Council. And his strategic voice has been sought by the NAC and the Canada Council for the Arts, and he also serves on boards including TO Live and Mass Culture. Recognition includes the Business and Arts Arnold Edinburgh Award, so you could think about nominating somebody else for this great award, and Stanford Impact Program for Arts Leaders. He holds an MBA from TMU and has studied theater at York University. And next up, we're going to invite Katrina Ingram, who is the founder and CEO of Ethically Aligned AI, a company focused on helping organizations to drive better outcomes in the design and development and deployment of AI systems. A seasoned executive, Katrina has over 2 decades of experience running both not-for-profit and corporate organizations in the technology and media sectors, as well as experience in the public sector. She was named to the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics list, and Katrina holds an undergrad in business administration from Simon Fraser University, a Master's of Art in Communications and Technology from the University of Alberta, and is an IAPP certified information privacy professional. So welcome to you both.
Thanks so much.
Thank you to have us.
So, yeah, to get started, I'm just going to reflect on, we have last month, Canada's Minister of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation, Evan Solomon, made a big announcement of a national AI task force composed of 26 experts. The task force members are all being asked to submit individual reports by November, which will contribute to shape the first draft of a national AI strategy, identifying core principles and key priorities. If Either of you were members of that task force. What would you want to include in your report as your core principles and priorities with respect to AI's relationship to arts and culture?
After you.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in on that. I'm just reflecting on my time in this space. I've been working in this space since 2018. And even back in 2021, I was having these conversations about AI, and people were like, why should I pay attention to this? And now we have a minister of AI. So look how far we've come in a pretty short period of time. So with respect to this question, I think in terms of this task force, one of the critiques that I'm hearing in my community, which is very much focused on responsible AI and ethics, is how things are being rolled out. And I think they're making some of the same mistakes that they made with their prior legislation, ADA, in not doing enough consultation with people, with citizens, with various stakeholders. So it's very focused right now. If you look at who's on the task force, it's the usual suspects. They're in industry, they're in academia, they're computer scientists. And yet we're all going to be impacted by this. So I think one of the first suggestions I would have is don't do this 30-day sprint consultation that you're doing, and really stretch that consultation piece out and get people involved. So that's kind of my first piece of advice. The other thing I would say is that they have to really grapple with this issue of data. And this is where it gets really specific to the arts community. And what I'm talking about is this idea that in order to build the AI systems that we have today, we had to scrape the internet, we had to take this data. And in some respects, the arts community is kind of like the sacrificial lamb in this whole model. And so that's the other thing that I think we really need to figure out if we're going to do things well with respect to AI. So I'll stop there. I'll throw it over to Owais.
Yeah, thank you. I think my biggest so I should start by mentioning that while I am doing work with Canadian Heritage, I'm here today as an independent person, and nothing I say, in case it offends President Trump or something, Mark Carney is not approving anything I say. I speak in my own capacity. My opinions are my own. I think it would be great for a start for a task force of this nature to have any arts and cultural or creative industries focus or representation. All the experts on it and all the folks on it are really smart people who are leaders in their field. But given how much of an impact AI is going to make in creative industries and how much concern there is, I think, in these sectors, the fact that we don't actually have, and this is, repeating a little bit of what Katrina's mentioned, this has been a past pattern. There was a pan-Canadian AI strategy. There was an AI adoption strategy. There was funding for lots of different kind of key milestone things that I think are very important and should be happening. And the creative industries in the sector hasn't been represented at the highest level of this conversation in a meaningful way. And from what I'm hearing from folks, is that there is an appetite to engage, there is a desire to engage and to be more involved in the creation of anything with the word strategy in it, anything that has implications for our collective futures. So I would start with having representation from the creative industries and culture sector, which is such a massive and diverse group of different types of peoples from across the country. And then beyond just the engagement of these communities, some of the biggest areas of concern, one of them very particularly around creative industries, is the copyright challenge. I wish I had a quick solution that I could just say, this is how we're going to have to completely fix all of the copyright challenges, because there is a very complex challenge that is being hashed out in courts right now, and very smart people in government are already working on. But there does need to be, I think, a much broader and much more holistic approach to thinking about what might entirely new copyright paradigms look like that we could possibly imagine today. What does support for Canadian copyright holders look like? What does making sure that we have future forward models for compensation, for recognition, for protection, but also for allowing of remixing and transformation and all the good things that come from sharing work publicly. Anyways, there's a lot there that needs to get addressed and should be probably one of the key priorities of this group. With regards to the environment, I hope that they have some core principles around a sustainable and green future, and the issues we've seen around water consumption, around energy consumption. These are not unique to AI, and AI did not by any means, or the AI industry or the computers that power them did not create our environmental challenges, but we still needed to fix those, and they've only gotten more challenging now. So that has to be embedded in their core principles, and I think particularly important to our communities in the arts and culture and the creative industries is the sanctity of our planet is going to be necessary if we're going to have a planet. And lastly, I'll say around another area that I think a lot of people are very concerned, and to Katrina's point, average citizens, I think, are facing the most concern around is what do we do about bias? What do we do about trust? I'm actually teaching a course right now to first-year students in the entire creative school, and it's called Wicked Problems and Creative Interventions, a new course, and we're getting them to tackle the wicked problem this year. The theme is declining social trust. And they are absolutely obsessed with the question of AI and how it's transforming our relationship to what institutions, what voices, what media can we trust? How do we trust? What declining trust in our society will mean for us? So I think this is a place where a strategy can't only just be fixated on the tools, but also think about what is the society that we want to live in, and how do we create the baseline level of trust that Canadians need in order to engage with each other in a productive way.
Mm-hmm. Katrina, you briefly mentioned the previous legislation, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. It was meant to be a first step towards a new regulatory system designed to guide AI technologies by Canadians and Canadian businesses. However, this legislation is now effectively dead. So what's the next steps for government? What's on their to-do list?
Yeah, so just to briefly touch on and revisit what was ADA, it was a combination bill. So there was two parts to it. One was dealing specifically with privacy. And so we have privacy laws in Canada, which is fantastic, but they're very old and they need to be updated. They certainly don't address the kinds of issues that we're seeing today with how we're using data, specifically with processing and machine learning and AI. So there was that part of the bill. And then there was another part of the bill that was meant to regulate the AI itself. So this, I think, speaks to this idea of automation. And it was largely modeled after the EU AI Act, which actually did come into effect. And it took this kind of risk-based approach. So that's what ADA was. Where I think we're at today for a number of different reasons, not the least of which we are in a very different geopolitical moment than we were a couple of years ago. And so what I think is happening now at this moment is a lack of appetite to regulate AI, perhaps at all. So I'm not convinced that we're going to see anything like an ADA again. I have heard that the government is thinking about updating the privacy components and doing some updates to the privacy law. So we might see some of that happening. But with respect to bigger, broader regulation around AI, I'm not holding my breath on that. I don't think that's necessarily going to be a thing. And so I think with respect to the arts community, where does that leave us? I think it leaves us where we started some of this conversation with question one. What is going to happen? Are we going to just keep going down this path? Are we going to wait and see what other courts are going to say about copyright? What is that going to look like? What does that mean for artists in the meantime? Because we all seem to be in this now very much without any regulation. And so there's a lot of questions about what exactly is going to happen in this kind of environment that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Owais, in his announcement last month, Minister Solomon proclaimed we were in a Gutenberg moment where AI is disrupting fundamental ways we work and learn and create. In history, we've seen major technology disruptions, such as the Gutenberg press, cause a lot of anxiety for industries and for individuals alike. And I would say that there's definitely a lot of anxiety in the arts and culture sector about AI. But you wrote an article in January called How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love AI. So tell us, as a theater practitioner, how have you embraced AI?
I was actually using generative AI particularly. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack here. One is like, what is AI? What are we even talking about? Tinder's matching is AI. Autocorrect is AI. If you've done a Google search in the last 20 years, there was some kind of AI involved. Machine learning was, deep learning was like very much happening and not sexy, and nobody was talking about before the kind of current moment happened. So, the underlying technology piece behind it, I think, has been happening slowly in the background, maybe of most people's consciousness for a long time. And we've enjoyed a lot of rewards and fruits of the innovations in that space. Fundamentally, when I think about what anxiety is, it's a sense of loss of control. It's a feeling that something is happening that I don't have agency in, or I don't know, I have an unanticipated or unpredictable outcome. And I think what's particularly challenging about the world we're in is the pace of innovation in AI has happened far faster than like the pace of innovation happened with the internet. And even the smartphone took a decade before. Now we're getting to the place where we're like, okay, here's the stuff. Smartphone, bad for kids, okay for adults, but put on an app timer so you don't scroll to yourself to death. Like it took us a while to figure out, what exactly this was going to mean for us. The speed of the change, the speed of the adoption, I think, is something that we're all struggling with. It's a roller coaster of activity. So I think that anxiety is like totally understandable, given what we are collectively feels like. And also it doesn't help that people keep trying to sell us on this hype thing of AGI and super intelligence and these very, very sci-fi scenarios of amazing, incredible things that are going to transform things. I think the caution that I always have when reading all these proclamations of like massive amounts of intelligence being unleashed on the world is a lot hasn't happened. Like a lot of stuff, like even 6 months ago, if you'd asked me, I was talking about AI agents and how we were going to unleash a whole bunch of agents everywhere and they're going to do all this work on their own, which was the thing everybody was talking about. And now nobody really thinks that that's going to happen. None of the experts are like expecting that there's going to be that level of automation. It's actually much more complicated than we thought. And we haven't seen the massive amounts of a distillation. So surprise, surprise, like any technology, there are some things that are really amazing and we're able to use them right away and they immediately transform work. There's some things that are going to be very challenging. They're going to take a long time to solve or they will never change. It's Ethan Mollick is an academic at Wharton who has this phrase, the jagged frontier, which I think really perfectly describes where both AI technologies are, that they're really amazing at some things, really terrible at other things. We haven't all figured out which ones are which, and that situation is also dynamic and it's changing. When I started playing with generative AI, I was using an LLM called Da Vinci, which is what GPT-2 was called before it was public. And I was trying to build a chatbot to help navigate the Canadian Theatre Agreement, because is one of the documents that I'm most afraid of as a theater producer. And it was an experiment that I worked on for months, and I had like professional developer help, and it was very complicated at the time, and it didn't really work. The intelligence of that model wasn't there. Today, uploading a copy of the CTA into ChatGPT and saying, "Hey, can you help me answer questions?" is actually a very trivial thing to do. And I, in my own work and my own practice, have found such a massive improvement in the things that were drudgery, things that were not possible, things that I could never have hired help for. And so many folks in the sector that I talk to, whether it's small organizations, biggest of institutions that I'm working with, everybody's operating at 150%. Everybody has burnout, overwork, capacity, funding restraints is like endemic across our industries. So the idea that we could increase our productivity, increase our efficiency, have a little bit of better quality of life, and work-life balance and well-being in our workplace, I see the potential of that as being really, really exciting. And that's for me why I've spent so much energy in the last few years, kind of getting further and further into what further tools should we be building and what is the work that is not helping us. It's not like we shouldn't maybe doing this much work just to stay afloat, just to survive. I don't think anybody since at least the pandemic has felt like that they're in a great place, that their organization or their workload is totally manageable and they've finally got on top of it. It feels like since pandemic times that we've just been getting further and further behind, more and more anxious about it. And we just see people leaving. We see people leaving the sector. We see organizations closing. We see people leaving the city. We see like a gradual death happening, I think, of a lot of our best talent in this community. So that's also where I go, I don't want to lose these people that I work with, and I don't want to lose this work. So if we can do it better, and there are tools that we could use to help us do that, then I want to try and find ways to embrace that. And that doesn't mean that we have to embrace all of it. That doesn't mean we can't critique it, and doesn't mean, in fact, we really should. We really need people like Katrina who are trying to make sure that we're doing things in a way that is productive and helpful for us, rather than a complete disengagement. And then it really will happen to us rather than with us.
Yeah. Well, avoiding burnout and being more efficient does seem like the dream. So that's a good segue to Katrina. Many people somehow assume that ethics and innovation are at odds, but how can we help organizations balance the excitement of AI with the needs for thoughtful governance? What steps would you recommend that we all go through to craft policies or guidelines around AI?
Well, number one, we need to challenge the narrative that ethics and innovation are at odds. I don't think they're at odds at all. And in fact, if we're going to have adoption, which is what everybody says they want, we actually need to have ethics. Do you want to have a car without brakes, for example? I don't think you do. But this is a story that comes up. This is not even an AI story. Think about the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And you can just imagine all those industrialists saying, hey, we can't do this without child labor. There is no way that this is going to work. And lo and behold, we figure it out. So I think that we need to challenge that narrative, ask for better. We can do better. We can figure it out. And that's really what drives and motivates me in terms of my work. I think we can do better. Okay, so let's talk about you. Let's assume you want to use AI in your organization. How might you go about doing better? I think the first thing to do is to sit down and get really clear about what your values are. And this really speaks to the kinds of tools that you might feel comfortable bringing into your organization. I'm not even talking about AI. I'm talking about all kinds of vendors and tools and that sort of thing. And get really clear on your values. And that's really important because when you start looking at those values in light of AI, in light of some of the things we've been talking about, the environmental cost of using some of these technologies, the fact that the data was questionably acquired, that's the polite way of saying it. Stolen is maybe the less polite way of saying it. Copyright issues around that data. You have to contend with that. You have to contend with how this technology was made using unethical supply chains. So they have to prepare the data. They do that offshore. People aren't paid very well. There's a lot of trauma in that process, and that's been well documented. So you have that going on, and then you have the massive amounts of computing power, the environmental issues. Are you okay with that? You got to ask yourself that, because if you are not, maybe that factors into if or how you are going to use it. So that's sort of one thing that you need to get really clear on. When it comes to actually thinking about, is AI useful? I think one of the things that I find challenging right now is there's a narrative that we should sprinkle AI pixie dust everywhere. It's going to be a net improvement on everything. Everybody's going to be more productive and more efficient, and isn't that fantastic? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. There's research now that shows that is not necessarily the case. So I think thinking through realistically, where do we need these tools? What can be the benefit? What do you consider AI? Like, I don't think we should worry about every instance of Grammarly and spell check. But if you're putting in place a system that's going to decide the triaging of resumes and who you're going to hire, that's a pretty high risk case. So how are you going to actually think about AI in the context of your organization? So that's step number two. Stakeholder consultation, going back to what I think the government should be doing more of, you need to do that as well. And you need to be clear on the values of your community, or that is going to get you into hot water. So figuring out how you're going to consult with your stakeholders, both internally and externally. I think the good news is, as arts organizations, I think you're pretty good at that. I think that generally speaking, the arts as a sector does more of that and better than some other organizations. So I think that's a real strength. And then it just comes down to drafting the policy. So this is kind of the classic acceptable use. And I think get really clear on not just what is prohibited, but what is allowed. And so really clear on that. And then the last piece is, this isn't really a one and done. So there's going to be new tools, there's going to be new things that you're going to consider. There might be some regulations somewhere down the line. You're going to need to think about that. So then there's this sense of monitoring it, adjusting, iterating. And those are the 5 steps that I walk clients through when they talk about wanting to adopt AI.
Mm-hmm. A lot to consider. It's common for individual staff members to experiment with AI independently to make their tasks easier. You were talking about that always. But sometimes workers may worry about whether it is allowed or if it's cheating. How can leaders support and encourage innovation and efficiencies while setting responsible boundaries?
Yeah, it's a good question right now. In particular, Work and Cultures just released a report
Mhm.
looking at participants, arts workers in the sector, I think about 106 or something, and looking at their various use of AI, their perceptions of it, their attitudes toward it. Um, I believe it's about half of people have used AI in some capacity in there. Yep, you're welcome, Brianne. I'm sure they will put a link for the report. They're doing a thing about it tomorrow that you can go to as well. But the interesting thing about the adoption rate is that about half of people have already used it in some capacity and are interested in it. So we're already in the adoption curve, I think, well past the early adopters. And I think now from the early majority tipping over into late majority, where the majority of people are curious or have engaged with these tools in some capacity and see the value in them. So what I think it really behooves us now, if you're in any kind of organization, is to have some kind of policy, have some kind of conversation in your space around what your expectations are of each other. And to not have one, I think, creates a vacuum that leaves people feel anxious. Like my students are very much like this, and I suspect a lot of workers are like this, where I would rather have a clear structure that is tells me what I can and can't do than for me to have to guess. And the again
Mhm.
additional anxiety that comes from not knowing what your leadership is thinking, and because it's a fast-moving, rapidly changing space that we don't have, fully formed and matured, I think it's also okay to encourage a community of discussion around it, and maybe create a committee that meets regularly and discusses, what's happening right now, what are people trying to do, what challenges are they encountering, what questions are coming up in the team, and like where do we sit on these. I feel like it needs active engagement with leadership, with the staff, and often the new staff, younger staff, there's lots of people who are probably using it much more sophisticatedly and with much more effectiveness than sometimes senior people in the company who've been doing things a certain way for 30 years and feel very comfortable in those ways and don't feel super comfortable with this new shiny thing. And that's okay. Like I'm a huge fan of reverse mentorship and learning from people younger than myself. And I feel like there's an opportunity with any innovation to embrace a little bit more of a multi-directional conversation. It doesn't have to be that the most senior person in the organization has to be the benchmark of what the
Mhm.
organization's knowledge is about something. They can just pick a champion in the company and say, this person seems to be really into it. Yes, they're 25 and an intern, but they are going to be our leader in terms of organizing us and bringing us tools and organizing our workshops. And it just, I think, requires a deliberate, intentional choice. And Katrina already mentioned the thing of like, know your values, articulate them clearly. I don't think you need a whole new set of values just because there's a new tool in the equation. Your values ideally are consistent across tools and across your, if you had an EDIA policy that I'm sure you wrote in 2020 after the Black Lives Matter protests, and so there's whatever you decided was important to you then should still apply, and you need to figure out, and any work that employees are doing, whether they're using AI assistants or not, needs to be accountable to those policies, to those goals that you set out for yourself about equity, about inclusion, about justice. So I don't know that it needs new as much as it needs a honest investigation of what did we care about yesterday, and
Mhm.
what are we trying to achieve today, and involving the people who are the most knowledgeable about it in the process.
Mhm.
I just want to react to something before we move on, because I'm seeing a really interesting dynamic with these AI tools that's different than the usual technology arc. The usual technology arc is the young people are championing it and the old people need to get on board. I'm seeing
Mhm.
the opposite, the opposite.
Mhm.
And so Gen Z is in some cases the most resistant to these technologies. And I think, this is just me speculating, it's because of what's happening to them. They're the ones not getting the opportunities. They're not getting the internships. They're the ones whose lives have been digitized. Maybe from before they were even born, pictures of them were posted on Facebook. So I think it's really interesting, this moment that we're having, where it's not necessarily the youngest people that are championing the technologies. And
Mm.
that's very different than other technologies that we've seen.
Yeah, that's true. I think we're seeing Gen Z feeling, in fact, the most anxiety about what it's going to mean for their career paths and their opportunities.
But Gen Z, again, like I've been dealing with a lot of young people the last couple of years in the university. Like they were unbelievably anxious well before AI came on the scene. I read a report in my first year of joining the university in 2020 that 2/3 of students coming into university were experiencing overwhelming sense of anxiety about the world in their lives. Like I do think that like that entire generation has a much more holistic anxiety challenge probably because of the information overload that came to them in the form of the smartphone and the amount of global challenges that they are receiving at a very young age. Like it's a very complex thing to unpack, and AI adding to the speed of it all, I think doesn't help anybody feel secure or feel safe.
Yeah, we have a ton of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to go to them in a second. I just want to return to the point that Owais made at the beginning about bias. To you, Katrina, many experts have pointed out that large language models are only as good as the inputs they're using, so garbage in, garbage out. And when it comes to, things like reviewing resumes in the hiring process, how can organizations ensure the AI tools they're using don't unintentionally reinforce biases?
Yeah, it's an enormous question, and there's a lot of ways to think about this. I think sort of maybe the best way to think about this, there is the data issues for sure, and garbage in, garbage out is definitely a thing. It's not just the data though. And I think I think there's this idea that, well, we'll perform a data debiasing exorcism and all will be fine. That's not really how it works. And so we need to kind of think about also what we're trying to do with the tool. How is it making its prediction in the case of who you should hire, for example, and what might be the values that are encoded in that algorithmic process that are leading to a biased result. And the tricky part is figuring out how to technically make that happen in a way that's acceptable. And the reason that's tricky is we can't have it always. And as humans, we have sort of this intuitive sense of when a particular procedure is fair. For example, everybody gets one vote, and we say procedurally that's really fair in that context. But in a different context, maybe it makes sense to have a different definition of what is fair. Like we're going to right some historical wrongs, for example. So we're going to lift up a certain group, and maybe that is fair in that context. The challenge is to translate that mathematically. You can't have it all ways. You're going to have to decide what that is, and that can be very tricky. So that's kind of one thing. That's with respect to predictive AI. With respect to generative AI, I think a lot of that comes down to how are people being represented. And so there was a study, for example, that if you prompt a picture of a CEO, most of the times you're going to get a white man. Why is that? Because there's a lot of white male CEOs that were represented in the training data. And so the way to think about correcting for that bias is being the human in the loop. So you can prompt for something different and get better diverse results. So that's with generative AI. But it's a big topic and it's a complex topic, but hopefully that sheds a little bit of light on it.
Great. Okay, we're going to shift to some of the many questions from the audience, and there's so many good ones. It's actually a little hard for me. I kind of need an AI tool to parse these questions. But I'm going to start with one here from Inga Petri. U of T has decades worth of pioneering AI researchers, famously Professor Hinton, being the best known father of AI. Can you discuss how ownership of models and platforms could be used to empower Canadian interests, artists, or creatives? Are there large Canadian players today in the field that we should know about?
Trina?
Do you want me to take that one? Okay.
Yeah.
So we do have, I guess, a Canadian player that would be considered large is Cohere. So Cohere, Aidan Gomez is the CEO, spun out of, I think Aidan did an internship at Google or one of the big tech companies, and then came and spun up a tech company here. So
He was a co-author of the paper that invented transformers, as we currently understand them.
Okay, there you go. So he's
one of Jeffrey Hinton's students, and
students. Yeah, there you go. So there's a connection there, and they're probably the most well-known in terms of doing the work of like a large language model. They're very focused on enterprise though. So it's not the same as OpenAI. Here you go, everyone, go and use ChatGPT for free. It's not that kind of a thing. My understanding is they're focused on helping large scale enterprises do their thing. So from that perspective, I don't know how applicable that is for you as a sector or as an organization. So that's why I bring that up. But part of the challenge is we're very focused, and this isn't just an AI thing, this is just a tech thing. We are very dependent on the American tech stack. And that is going to be a challenge for us. So it's not just about having the data in Canada. That's one piece of it. That's the idea of digital data sovereignty in the sense of having control of your data on Canadian soil. But there's also this bigger issue of around how is it being processed, what tools are we using? And really, we don't have, I think, a lot of great choices for the average types of tools that we might want to act, like email and Word docs and these kinds of things. Those are all really like big tech from America. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Developers of AI have used arts of all forms to build AI capacity, most without permission or involvement of the creatives, as you touched on earlier, Katrina. Are there moves by any arts advocates or legislators to bring communication between AI developers and the arts community together to lead conversations around the development of AI without hurting or exploiting creatives? I think maybe Owais, you might have some thoughts on this.
I think there isn't enough of that, but I know there are teams in OpenAI. They hire artists and content creators and digital media people. They have some very famous names of major artists and celebrities who are working with them. Before they released Sora, they worked with content creators, filmmakers, digital media people. It's, I think, something that I would like to see much more of. And part of the thing that I think the sector needs to also do more of is like ask for that. Like I think one of the things that like I'm working with people in these spaces and development spaces, it's a little bit of like they don't see us, right? So they don't know that this is a thing that they can get more of. Some of it has been thought about, but I do feel like raising our hand and saying, I would like to help with this. I would like to be more involved with this is a thing for us to do, and probably a thing for us to do more in a collective sense. I mean, as a sector, as a there is lots of people in on this call who represent large constituencies of the sector, whether they're art service organizations or funders or representatives of larger groups. Like raising your hand and saying, we'd like to work with people here, Canadian AI entity, like what kind of collaboration can we have? I think there is appetite for that. I do think that there is a room for that collaboration to be much deeper. And even with the policy writers and the people who are going to have to try and figure out what copyright looks like I'm not on the side of right now thinking that like the copyright problem is like as simple as deeming it all illegal or illegitimate, because the transformation part of it is complex. It is nuanced. It is not the same thing as saying, I took this copyrighted work and I recreated it. So there's a lot of baby in this bathwater, and parsing that out is going to be complex, and it's new to us, and we haven't had a model for this for a very long time. And we went through one transition of understanding copyright very differently from an analog era to the digital era. The music industry was completely upended. The print journalism industry was completely upended. Television has been completely changed. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons from those. We didn't always do a great job of like, thinking upfront about, and one of the things that's comforting about all the anxiety right now is like, I think we're doing a lot more thinking upfront about impact on individual artists, impact on small creators, impact on the people whose livelihoods are being affected in a way that we probably should have done in the 90s when Napster was first coming out. And, there wasn't as much long-term thinking of what is this music streaming future going to look like for this business. So I think more engagement is going to help, and that's just as much on us as a sector to raise our hand and ask for that engagement and not just wait to be invited.
We've had a couple people asking about good examples of AA policies. We've shared in the chat the link to the Rosa Foundation's 5-step guide, which Katrina was involved in. But is there any others that you wanted to highlight, Katrina or Owais, of excellent examples of responsible guides?
I don't know that I have an excellent example. I mean,
okay.
Our university released one that I think is fine for our purposes. I think I actually, you know what? I take objection to the question because I don't think right now, when something is so new and so rapidly evolving, I don't think our goal should be perfection. I think we should try to strive for best faith, best effort that we can do right now. One of the things that I'm generally very nervous about is an expectation that we should make no mistakes. Nobody should get anything wrong.
Mhm.
Everything should always be perfect and safe and 100% risk-free. And I think this is just new. Like we need to have a little bit of an appetite for a creative sector that like our entire premise is to take risks and to create the unknown. I think we can have a little bit more comfort in let's try some things, let's do them in good faith, let's be very transparent in our intentions and our values, let's communicate them explicitly, and then let's see what happens and let's measure the results. And we should reserve the right to constantly update our perspectives. I reserve the right to come back next time on this webinar and be like, you know what, actually think this is really bad and we should stop doing. Like I think a little bit of comfort with evolution is going to be more helpful than uh, hoping that there's some kind of perfect set of frameworks right now when it's still so new and it's still immature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, do your best and iterate. I think that's my summation.
Yeah, yeah. So if we have a design thinking lens on this, start somewhere, continue to grow it. How are funding bodies seeing generative AI impacting the volume of application for grant competitions? I think that is one of the first things that people working in the arts think, oh, I can use AI to write my grant. So what strategies are being adopted to cope with these increases?
I
I,
don't know. The funder.
yeah, I don't know
I,
for
I'm.
sure.
There are some funders here. I would love to hear from them if they've seen
Yeah.
it. I know there was a massive increase in applications to Canada Council, but I don't think it was caused as much by the rise of AI because it precedes that a little bit. It was more pandemic related shocks to the industry and the cost of living increasing very quickly, especially in major urban centers. The challenges in getting any other kinds of revenues have gone harder. So I I think that there might be more of an influx now, and as people get more comfortable with using the tools, we're definitely going to see that. I would love to see that mean that we get overwhelmed with written grant applications, and maybe this will be the end of written grant applications, which I think is a broken system and has been for a very long time, and unbelievably inequitable and unfair. So if an overwhelm of that system is caused by people submitting AI generated proposals, I'd be all for it.
Yeah, I think there's something there. Absolutely. I'm thinking about that meme where it's like, look how much I can write with AI. And it's like, look how much I can summarize with AI. And I think that meme might play itself out in a grant situation, which is really benefiting no one. We've got AI talking to AI, deciding things about grants. And so what's the better way? What's the opportunity to find the better way? That might be the real win here.
I think we are seeing quite similar, and I'm just trying to find it. There was a question about HR practices. Here it is. As productivity goes up due to adaptation of AI tools, how will that change hiring practices in the art sector? There's change management within the team with adoption of tools, but what about new hires? I think we're also really just seeing a huge number of applications when it comes to any job posting, but how do we adapt our hiring practices using AI?
It's a very difficult question. As Katrina mentioned, there is a lot of ethical considerations when looking at either modifying hiring processes or just, what roles you're hiring for, and how many and what different kinds of jobs need doing in any organization.
Mhm.
I would suggest when coming to a question like this, because it's so big, it requires a very deep investigation of lots of different consideration. I'd suggest starting by taking small steps in the directions that feel most comfortable and most ethical and most within the purview of the capacity of that organization or those people. Because there is absolutely going to be all kinds of new, and I know that in the private sector, AI-based interviewing is the norm now. And that said, there is studies that have shown that like AI interviewers reduced actually systemic bias, reduced sexism, racism, and other kinds of human bias that human interviewers had. It's not clear to me that we have matured enough with this technology at scale to really fully say what the long-term impacts of all of it is going to be. But on an individual organizational level, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean slam the brakes and steer clear from it, or slam the gas and go head first into something, especially if you don't feel like you understand it. I think in general, and one of the best uses of AI that I recommend to people all the time is like ask it to educate you about the things that you don't know, and find out more about the areas that you want to learn more about. This is really good at teaching. It's really I learned so much on a daily basis. I want to learn a thing, I ask one of my many systems to teach me in whatever level of knowledge I need, in whatever detail I need, in whatever capacity I need. So you can use these tools to help you figure out kind of where to start and how to get engaged.
So there's a great book called The Algorithm by Hilke Schellman, who's a reporter with the Washington Post. And she did a deep dive investigation into hiring tools and looked at a bunch of different things. And I recommend that as a resource if you're interested in that area. I do think there's a lot of caution that you should exercise when you're looking at that particular thing, just because of how high stakes it is and how many times we've seen failure happen, bias and other kinds of failure happen in that particular use case. That use case is called out in the EU AI Act as being very high risk. And I think most places agree that it is high risk. So be careful, be cautious with that. I would say maybe that's not your starting point. Maybe you want to start with something else and not necessarily move forward with it there.
We've got an interesting back and forth following up Owais's point about learning stuff.
Yeah, can I respond to that?
How do you verify those systems are
It's
telling
a great
the right
question.
thing?
I love the question, David. Thank you so much. So the same way that I used to verify when I learned things on the internet, which is I use critical thinking. I check sources. I look at the veracity of sources. I assess just the information on its face value and assess reasonableness. In areas where I'm really, really out of my depths and have absolutely no knowledge, I will do multiple information searches or multiple questions to multiple different sources and pit them against each other and fact check one AI from the other sometimes. Definitely one thing that more people need to do, which I don't think is as broadly used as people should be using, is making sure that you're trying out reasoning or thinking modes in whatever models you're using. Significant reduction in hallucinations, significant improvements in sourcing citations. I also just ask for that. I just say, tell me what sources you're using, and it does. That was a big problem in early models where it would just hallucinate a source, and that was very frustrating. But I think the thing that was helpful about that early engagement that I used to have when I was like playing around with these tools is I also found very quickly developing a spidey sense of like, what things do I need to check? And what am I doing with it, right? Am I is it a recipe for making chana dal? In which case the risk is relatively low to me and maybe my family's intestines, but it's not the same thing as like designing a policy for my organization of 500 people. Like I think different things require different levels of assessment of veracity of the sources and the checking of them. And these are also things that you can do with these tools faster and better and with much more level of detail than that what used to take me hours to dig through on internet searches. And I'm a firm believer in self-teaching, but it does need to come with critical thinking of our own. And this is where I don't worry so much about a lot of the descriptions of some of the comments and some of the things I hear constantly are about the fear. Ultimately, I think that people have is that AI is encroaching on something that we thought only we could do. This human thing, this creating thing, this writing, this generation thing. And I feel like that anxiety, that fear, it comes from this sense of this insecurity that we have that we're going to be replaced by something. I just don't, in my practice, my daily use of it, and I've been using it for years now, I just don't see that happening. Like I feel like I'm doing more work and I'm being more human and being more useful. Yes, I'm managing a whole bunch more artificial employees, I guess, but it hasn't replaced me, and it's actually made me significantly more capable in some of the work I do. And there's dangers with that too, right? Like it's going to give some people a false sense of confidence if they really don't know anything about the space. And this is where I do think like we need some larger trust tools for the society of like, what level of trust you can and can't have with different entities. But again, how that's going to manifest, I don't know. I think this is a question for us to figure out now.
Yeah, Katrina?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is we're not very good at that oversight piece. And I don't think it's because we're not trying to do good critical thinking, but we see time and again, we see stories of high stakes scenarios. I'm thinking about the false cases that get submitted in a legal brief. No one's doing that on purpose. No one's saying, hey, I think I'd like to get disbarred today. Let me submit these false cases. You presume that they've tried to do some level of checking, but it hasn't been successful. You look at the case recently with Deloitte, they charged the Australian government $440,000 for a big fancy report, riddled with all kinds of what looked to be AI errors. And I say what looked to be because they haven't completely admitted that they used AI. And so there's this idea of we're using it, we're not really disclosing it, we don't really have enough wherewithal to do all of that fact checking. If you're doing the fact checking, I saw this come up in the chat, are you really saving time? I don't know. Like, I suppose there are things I could fact check because I am an expert in that subject. And then there are things you could tell me about another subject that I'd have to go to a lot of effort and work and get access to the right resources to really have good, proper oversight. So I think part of the issue is we have a mental model of a search engine that we have been conditioned to use, to think of interacting with the internet that way for 25 plus years because of Google. And we're treating this tool the same way, and it does not work the same way, but we don't get that because we don't necessarily have a good sense of the underpinnings of it. And really, it's just predicting next probabilistic words or combinations of words. It doesn't know things. And so it's fundamentally quite different than an actual search engine. But we're combining it in ways that make it look seamless, like we're just getting access to all of that information. So I think that's kind of part of the danger in all of those.
Yeah. So one question from the Q&A box is should we all be obligated to say that we have used AI in the creation of documents or reports, or in fact even creative artworks?
Feels
Should it be
like right
disclosed?
now, because and I'm just reading the comments in the chat, like again, there's so many individual comments that I could respond to, and I would love to have human discussions with some of these people, but like I feel like we're starting in a very low trust place, so I don't think we can build trust until there's comfort and then there is a better understanding. And some of the examples Katrina mentioned, I'm like, I think there was mistakes made on part of individual people. There was probably assumptions of like what they could expect from this thing. The design of the thing was trying to be very helpful. So in the immediate, I don't think anybody benefits from obfuscating the use of it when we're so far away from like having a solid foundation of how these things show up in our world. And I also don't think that that should be a bad thing. I don't think that it should be a bad thing to use AI to create or to experiment if you're doing it responsibly and ethically and as best as you can. I do think that we need space for that. And I'm mostly just like trying to figure out, what are the actual things that I'm doing on a daily basis? What are the things that I'm working with, people that I'm working with that are struggling with? How can I make, the change intervention right here in front of me? And try not to get too caught up in like all of the big picture stuff, which is anxiety inducing, but I can't actually control all of it. I can kind of focus on my world and my locus of control and figuring out what is helpful and not helpful, and then sharing that with the people I work with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ironically, the Chinese government has mandated the disclosure policy on everything, text, video, and so forth. They obviously have their own reasons for doing that, but I just find it really interesting to see how something like disclosure can happen in certain contexts, maybe for not for the reasons we might want, but they're doing it nonetheless. So there are examples of the fact that it can be done. We know how to watermark the text, for example, but the companies behind these tools haven't necessarily embraced that. So there's kind of this technical level of disclosure. Ethically, I think as users of the tool, disclosing makes sense. What I do worry about, I'm going to flip to the opposite side of this argument, is all the cookie disclosures that we get and we like just click through them because we can't deal with another disclosure. What I hope this doesn't get to is something like that, because it becomes wallpaper at a certain point, and it's just like, okay, I'm too overwhelmed to think about like every little piece of text that was AI generated, for example. So I think finding, like, I think it's important at this moment, but finding the balance in the long run, I think is going to require like a lot of sorting through that as a society.
Yes. Well, that brings us to the close of our session. Thank you to everybody who submitted your questions. There were so many incredible questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. A big thank you to our speakers, Owais Lightwala and Katrina Ingram, for contributing your insightful thoughts and for answering all the questions from our audience. Many thanks to Power Corporation of Canada, our presenting partner of the Business and Arts Speaker Series. And we'd also like to thank our supporting partners, RBC and ACG. To learn more about any business and arts programs or events, you can head to the Business and Arts website for more information, or you can follow us on social media. And if you do follow us on social media, you may have seen the photos from this year's Business and Arts Awards, which took place in early October. And as I mentioned at the top of the session, the nominations for this year's awards are now open. Of particular interest to attendees today might be the Community Impact Award, which recognizes a partnership between an arts organization and a business at the local level. Or you might want to nominate a longstanding business partner for the Corporate Champion Award. To find out about each of the awards, please visit businessandarts.org/nominate. And many thanks, and have a wonderful day, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you again.